Right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Renee Calkins. I'm the Education Manager with the Michigan Center for Rural Health. The Michigan Center for Rural Health is a nonprofit state office of rural health, and a cornerstone of our office is to provide free education to rural healthcare providers. I will be the facilitator of this program, and I would like to welcome everyone to today's special populations grand round. This program provides one contact hour for social work, community health workers. We will also have a self-claim option for physicians and other disciplines. And we also provide one contact hour for nursing. And I would welcome Adrienne Wilkerson from the MSU College of Nursing to continue with the professional development information.
Thank you, Renee. I appreciate it. So, yep, as Renee was saying, this activity will provide one contact hour for nurses in addition to the other professionals that she mentioned on the previous slide. We do share that our provider statement on the screen for you to see. We are accredited directly through ANCC. And this activity also does meet criteria for the state of Michigan implicit bias CE credit. And that will be listed on the CE certificate as well. So when you get to the end and you complete your eval and the certificate comes to your email, just know that it will be listed on that certificate as well. And then Renee, at this point, are we popping up the poll? Okay. So Renee's going to pop up a poll because part of this requirement, or part of the requirement for this credit just includes having to do a pre-assessment question. And so we're building it in here as a poll. So please take a moment. I'll give you guys 20 or 30 seconds just because I know people sometimes move away from the screen and then have to kind of find it and come back to it. So I just want to give people a moment to kind of catch up and do that poll. And then I'll go ahead and just kind of keep talking as you guys are doing the poll and let you know completion criteria and disclosures until the poll closes, which we're getting close to. So for this activity, completion criteria is obviously you're doing the pre-assessment poll question, that you're participating in the learning activity along the way, which just means if you have questions along the way, please put those in the chat. And our wonderful speaker can kind of gauge if he wants to gather those along the way or collect them for the end. So we'll have some Q&A discussion time at the end for you guys. And then, as I was saying, that third part is the completion of the evaluation. So we'll share that link at the very end. And we just ask that you complete that eval just as soon as possible, right away if you can, because that's just when the content is freshest in your mind and kind of helps facilitate the progress for us as well. And then we do know that it doesn't, that you can't always do it right away because you're kind of in the middle of a workday, lots of you guys. So Renee does send that out and it stays open for a few days for you to complete after if needed. And then for disclosures, no commercial interest associated with today's activity to disclose, and no one with the ability to control content has a relevant financial relationship with an ineligible company to disclose. And then finally, I'll just bring you guys back to the learning outcome to refocus us back to where we want to be. We hope that you'll walk away with increased knowledge of veteran culture to aid in overcoming bias when treating veterans in healthcare settings. And with that, I will hand it back to Renee.
Thank you, Adrienne. I would like to introduce our presenter today. Dr. Adam McGuire is the director of the Elevate Research Lab and an associate professor at the University of Texas at Tyler. His research focuses on understanding how to integrate positive psychology principles into mental health treatment for veterans suffering from trauma-related distress, including the development of novel web-based interventions for PTSD. He also leads the veteran mental health specialty track within the clinical psychology PhD program and is a licensed psychologist in the state of Texas. Thank you so much for being here today. We truly appreciate it. And with that, I will stop sharing so you can share.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. Thank you all for coming. I'm really excited to have the chance to talk to you about veterans and working with veterans, veteran culture. Let me see, before Let me pull up my slides here.
I do have a poll too, if you want to ask that now for you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
let me here, I'll do just another tiny quick introduction and then we'll do the poll. Thank you for reminding me. I did forget about that, but thank you. Um, yeah, I guess even before I share my slides, I can just just elaborate on the introduction. But as Renee mentioned, I'm at the University of Texas at Tyler, and part of what I do in addition to the research with veterans is because I lead this veteran mental health track, I work with students to help with veteran cultural training. So we try to help students who want to become psychologists or mental health care workers, help them get a sense of what it's like to work with veterans. And so I've done a fair amount of that, here, and also wanted to just say it's fun being able to talk to y'all because I'm originally from Michigan. I'm in Texas now, but I grew up in Michigan. Went to the University of Michigan as undergrad. I hope that's okay to say here, but yeah, so it's really fun, kind of full circle. So maybe that would be the caveat of yeah, I see some Go Blues already. That's great. The caveat, we're going to put up a poll, but the caveat too of putting this up is that it's important for me to tell you I'm actually not a veteran. I am not a veteran. I just work with a lot of veterans. I have a lot of care and compassion and passion for working with veterans, but I am not a veteran myself. So want to try and get a little bit of sense of who y'all are in terms of your relationship to veterans or veteran status, and then also kind of your experience with that. So I get a sense of, kind of what kind of different backgrounds we're working with. So yeah, Renee, would you be able to share that poll now? Yeah, this first question is just getting a sense of how many veterans or service members or reserves do we have in the meeting, which is good to know. And then how much experience have you had working with veterans in your current position? So I'm gonna give a minute. I'm gonna share my screen while that's going. Let's see here. Okay. Just gonna let the poll run for a minute longer. All right. So it looks like we got most folks in. It looks like we just have a couple veterans, um, no active duty folks, no one in the National Guard or Reserves. So mostly everybody here is not a veteran themselves as a civilian, and that's good to know. I will say, hey, full permission for the veterans in the house. You can, call me out, correct me, whatever you need to do. Please. Like I said, I'm not a veteran, so I'm always more than happy to get feedback from those who are. So please feel free to pipe in if you want to add something to the discussion. And I think we'll be monitoring the chat throughout, so we can, incorporate that as well. And then in terms of the experience, let's see, it looks like most people have little experience. They're saying little experience in working with veterans, about 58% little. We got 28% saying a moderate amount, and then we kind of have a very few people on the ends of saying no experience or a lot of experience. So, okay, this is very helpful to know. And hopefully this information then will be useful for you. So let's go ahead and get started. Quick disclosure, this presentation and everything in here, this all represents my personal views. This does not represent the views or an endorsement by the Department of Veterans Affairs or the United States government. It's important to point out. Okay, let's see here. So I'm trying to manage all my screens here. I'm going to just close out the chat, and then Renee, if you don't mind, if we can kind of wait till the end, but if there's something that pops up that you see that would be helpful, feel free to interrupt me.
Yep,
Okay.
absolutely.
Thank you. Okay,
Mhm.
so yeah, what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about working with veterans. We're going to talk about veteran culture specifically, and the way that if I'm being tasked with trying to convey important things to know about veteran culture in a brief 1 hour period, because 1 hour is not a lot of time. It's not even an hour, at this point, but so it's not very much time. What I typically do is I refer to this organization called Psych Armor, and check them out after this if you're interested in learning more about them and more about this topic. They're it's a really cool organization that has a lot of trainings and a lot of resources. But one neat project that they did is they kind of surveyed a bunch of veterans or asked a bunch of veterans, what are things that you want healthcare providers or even just civilians to know about what it's like to be a veteran. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over those 15 things that veterans have identified. Again, because I'm not a veteran myself, so I want to kind of place it in the context of centered from their perspective as much as I can. And then we're going to talk about those 15 things, and I'll kind of elaborate on different aspects as we go along. So that's the source of this Psych Armor. It's a great tool, great resource. So check that out. So let's kind of dive in here with the first thing that veterans want us to know, us civilians and healthcare workers, is that they're not all soldiers. And I think, if you've probably heard people refer to veterans or people who are in active duty as soldiers, but really soldiers are just specifically referencing the Army, the branch of the U.S. military that is the Army. All these other branches have different names. And so if you're going into working with a veteran and you're automatically assuming they're a soldier or talking about them in the context of being a soldier, you're kind of fighting an uphill battle if they're not in the Army or if they were not in the Army. You're kind of already showing your hand of like, hey, you're somebody who doesn't get it, who doesn't know. So there's 6 branches. And then each of them have different names. So airmen for Air Force, Coast Guardsmen for Coast Guard, Marines are in the Marine Corps, sailors in the Navy, and Guardians for Space Force. There's not the Space Force is a newer branch of the military, and there's not a ton of service members in there, and probably at this stage pretty unlikely to encounter many of those folks. But regardless, so we have each of those different branches and they all have different names. But another thing that's important to understand about this idea that not everyone is a soldier is that each of these branches has really like their own mission, but also their own culture. They all have different unique experiences given their specific tasks, and then also cultures that build within each one. And so it's hard to even if you become really familiar with working with soldiers or working with people who served in the Army, not all of the things that you might learn from those folks are going to apply to somebody who is in the Navy or the Air Force, let's say. So that's important. One really important thing to remember out the gate: not everyone is a soldier. Another important part that gets overlooked quite a bit is that the reserves are a part of the military. And so, in addition to what we would say are active duty service members, which when we talk about active duty, we're saying people who are full-time in the military, which that is, 24/7, which we'll talk about in a second. But in addition to that, people can serve in the reserves, and they're trained to serve, but they also have day-to-day civilian jobs. So people in the reserves, they're a part of these different branches, and you can see like each of the branches has their own reserve. Will have their own reserve units, but people can be a part of the military by being in the reserves and still have their civilian jobs. And so we also don't want to dismiss these folks either. Sometimes people will transition from being active duty and they might go back to civilian life and come back to the reserves, or they might transfer to the reserves. Just depends. But this is a whole different sector of what we would think of as people in the military or veterans. And so I think, I don't know how accurate this is right now, but I think it was maybe 2023 or 2024. I think the number of active duty military was around 1.3, 1.4 million. But the number of people serving in the reserves was, I think, 700, 800,000. So it's not a small amount. There is a good chunk of people who are in the reserves. And then in addition to that, you have the National Guard. So you have the Army National Guard and the Air National Guard. And all of these, the National Guard is more at the can be more deployed at like the state level. There's a little bit of a state component to that. But people can serve in all these different areas, and they can also be mobilized, like I was saying, as needed, but they can be deployed as needed too, in cases of emergency, in cases of uh, disaster, things that can come up, they could be deployed as well. So this is another section of the military that often gets overlooked. So even if you don't have someone who's active duty or who just recently separated, important to think about, anyone with reserve experience and how that might differ as well. Okay, number three, not everyone in the military is infantry. So not everyone is, in a tank or on patrol or at the front lines. It's important to understand that, there is a wide range of jobs that people can have when they're in the military. And so this is just a list of some of the different categories, but you could have things from, technicians to mechanics, cooks, doctors, healthcare workers, a really wide range of ways that people can serve in the military. Sometimes it's a military occupational specialty. You hear MOS referred to as a term that designates which area of what is their specialty, where are they specifically serving. And so yeah, important when you're thinking about working with a veteran, or if you have someone who's in front of you who's identified as a veteran, what probably happens for a lot of folks, especially when they're first starting to work with this population, is they probably have an image in their mind of, they have a gun, they're on the front line or whatever it is, especially if it's during like wartime or something, or if they served during a time of war. And that can absolutely be the case, but that can kind of, in some ways, not cloud your judgment, but give you a different impression of that person's experience. And so one thing that you can do when you're working with a veteran and you're trying to learn about them and about their experiences is you can ask him about their job. What job did you have in the military? You can ask them about where did they serve? And even just you being able to demonstrate like, oh, I'm not going to assume that you were in a tank the whole time you were over there, whatever it is, right? But demonstrating that you don't know and that they may have different experiences because they will have different experiences across these different jobs, right? Is a nice way to kind of build some rapport with folks right away and demonstrate you're wanting to learn and understand their experience. So not everyone is in the infantry. It's important to understand. Okay, number four, military has leaders at every level in the chain of command. And so there is a broadly speaking, across all the different branches, there's going to be some kind of chain of command, right? There's going to be leadership, there's going to be ranks within each branch. Now, one thing to point out is that it differs between branches. So like the specific structure of ranks is different in each individual branch, but the overall theme, or one important theme to understand, is there is a chain of command and that it's important and respected, and that those leadership roles, those different kind of leadership roles, they all serve a specific purpose, but that there's a point of pride in understanding the rank, understanding the chain of command, and respecting the chain of command. And so, you know, again, thinking about when you're working with veterans, probably where they fall within these different rank structures would tell you a lot about what their experiences were like, and they could probably tell you about that. But important to understand, or they want us to understand, that there is a chain of command and that leadership plays a big role in how veteran culture is experienced. And that is again a point of pride too, that everyone follows the chain of command. And that's how they're able to operate, right? Okay, so and just listed there is, commissioned officer versus other kinds of enlisted officers, like non-commissioned officer, warrant officer. Warrant officer is like a specialty kind of specialty expertise type of officer. So there's a range of different ways in which people can serve in leadership roles in the military. Okay, number five, military is always on duty. So I mentioned this earlier when I was talking about service members who are active duty, but their work is 24/7. It's not, there's not a clock where you're punching in, you're punching out at the end of the day at 5 o'clock. If folks are on active duty, there is no off day, there is no off time. Now they can get time off, for specific periods of time, but generally speaking, it's not like a weekend where for the rest of us, the end of the workday, 5 o'clock hits and we're going home and ready to relax and watch some TV, right? So it's a different it's a different work experience, obviously, because their work is their entire life, 24/7. But the other thing that goes into that is they have to be ready around the clock. They have to be ready to do whatever is asked of them at the drop of a hat, 24/7. And so that is a obviously very different experience from how most of us have our jobs. And part of the reason too why military culture gets built into uh, their lives and their experiences, because it's how they lived out every single moment of that time in service in that way. So, okay, so number 5, military is always on duty. Let's keep it moving here. Number 6, they take pride in their appearance and conduct. So, uh, this kind of speaking to like bigger aspects of veteran culture, it's important to know that yes, within the branches and within the military, there is a level, a standard that everyone has to adhere to. And superficially, there's a standard of just even how people look, how their uniforms are worn. There's a lot of structure within even how they appear in their specific role. But there's also standards for how they behave. There's things that are codes of conduct or standards for how they behave towards superiors, how they behave towards peers, how they behave towards civilians. And so there is an underlying source of expectation of how you appear and how you act as a service member, and that again is something that they take pride in, and a strength that some of those things carry over, when they separate from the military and transition to civilian life. That's going to be a theme of many of the things we talk about. Is these are one of the things that going over to civilian life, there may be some habits that are hard to break, so to say, or changes that might that transition can be hard in some ways, but there are also many positive things and strengths that folks take away from that experience that can be really useful in day-to-day life afterwards. So important to be aware of this aspect as well. Okay, let's talk about the kind of mental health aspect a little bit, and this is probably particularly relevant for those of you who are going to be working in the capacity of working with veterans, if you happen to work with a veteran for some kind of mental health care. Number 7, this is something that remember, veterans are telling us this is something they want us to know, that they did not all kill someone. I think I'm assuming that most people in this call probably understand that. They probably all of us here probably get that not every single veteran killed somebody. But, don't underestimate the assumptions that folks might make who have very little exposure to veterans, or even if the exposure is just strictly limited to media. And we're going to talk about that too in a second. But it's important to understand not everybody killed somebody, and those who have killed someone in the course of combat, in the course of their military service, they certainly do not want to talk about it. So this is one of those kind of things that it's a question that just trying to learn about a veteran's experience, or trying to get to know a veteran or understand kind of what their experience was like. This is just never a question that you should ask. You should never ask, did you kill anybody? That is obviously a very, very sensitive topic. And, there's even debates within research for psychotherapy about like the best way to approach that specific topic. And so it's definitely not a question you should just kind of throw out there and ask somebody. And important to keep in mind that not only is it that not everyone killed somebody, but not everyone was even in combat. You could have served and even had a job that was with infantry or something along those lines, but never saw any combat. That is totally possible. You could also have been in served at a time when there was a high degree of combat and warfare, but served in a different role where you weren't actually exposed to that on the front lines in the same way. So good to just not make that assumption at the baseline. Pretty easy one to take away and remember. Number 8, they also want us to know that not all of them have PTSD. And so I'm going to try not to go on too much of a tangent because this is kind of my area that I focus on. But the one thing that's really, really important for people to know, and I try to emphasize this for when talking about veteran culture, is that the the vast majority of people actually don't develop PTSD. The number I put on there, it's, there's a whole range of studies that have looked at what is the prevalence of PTSD in veterans. And the findings that people have can vary quite a bit. I'm kind of giving you like the higher end of people have there are studies that have found like maybe 15 to 23%, probably at the higher end, have been diagnosed with PTSD. We're talking about veterans specifically. And so that is a large number in comparison to the general population. That's for sure. They are at a greater risk of developing PTSD than the civilian population. There's not much question around that or debate around that. But the thing that gets overlooked here is that this whole other red area where the majority of folks don't develop PTSD. So most people will just naturally recover. Now, there's another part that's important to highlight here, and something that you should take into consideration, specifically if you're talking about working with somebody in the context of mental health, working with a veteran in the context of mental health. Another thing that they are at greater risk for, they're at greater risk for developing PTSD, but they are definitely at greater risk for exposure to a traumatic event. Specifically, when we say traumatic event, if I'm gonna reference like the DSM-5, we're talking about what we would say a criterion A event, where someone is exposed to some kind of event where there was actual or threatened death or serious injury or sexual violence, and they either witnessed that or experience those things themselves. So that's a criterion A event. By nature, by definition of, warfare and combat, if a veteran is deployed, or if a service member is deployed to a combat zone and they're serving in combat, they're being exposed to traumatic events. Again, keeping in mind, not everyone goes through that, but many veterans or service members, excuse me, are just going to have a higher level of exposure to these kind of events. And so that puts them at greater risk for developing PTSD. And we should keep in mind, the potential for that to develop for sure. But just in the back of your head, we don't want to dismiss the folks who have it, but in the back of your head, it's also just good to be reminded that, most people, even if they're exposed to these traumatic events, they will recover. And maybe it takes longer for some folks than others, but not everyone is going to come out as having PTSD. There's like I probably should stop. I'll move on in a second. Just want to say that there is some within like veterans, if you talk to veterans about this or some veteran communities, there's a real hang up in being perceived as broken. They don't want to be perceived as broken, even if they do have PTSD. And so trying to not fall into that pitfall of making the assumption like all veterans are broken in that sense, whatever that means in the first place anyway, right? But something important to consider. Not being dismissive of the folks who have it, but also not making assumptions. That's going to be a continuous theme, not making assumptions throughout. Okay, number 9, the veterans who do have invisible wounds of war, so we're talking like psychological wounds, right, are not dangerous or violent. So people who have psychological distress in the aftermath of serving, in the aftermath of potentially a traumatic event or some kind of intense exposure, they're not prone to becoming dangerous or display violence. And I think that is a myth that is held by some people. It is clearly something that veterans worry about in terms of us thinking about them. And this is kind of perpetuated by media to a certain extent. So I put, that's there's obviously Rambo there, but then there's American Sniper. That's Bradley Cooper from American Sniper. And some media portrayals of veterans, some are really good. some do a great job showing you the kind of struggle that veterans might be experiencing when they're dealing with specific symptoms. But some of them also just give you the impression that they're any second now, if a door slams, then they're gonna lash out and start hitting somebody, or they're gonna completely lose it. And I think um, some veterans might have that fear. Some veterans who are suffering from really severe PTSD are concerned about, I'm worried what's going to happen if I can't handle my emotions or something. But that doesn't actually mean that they do display a lot more violence or they are actually dangerous. It's just not the case. So that's a myth, and we want to be respectful and we want to be caring and compassionate, but we also don't have to pretend like, they're a box full of fireworks that are ready to go off any minute. Okay, number 10. This is really important, particularly for this call and the folks we're talking to, that it's hard to ask for help. Veterans want us to know that it's hard for them to ask for help. And there are a wide range of reasons why it's so hard for veterans to ask for help. So one part is, military culture itself, and that doesn't necessarily embed a huge willingness to seek out help because, like it says on the slide, there's a long history of promoting emotional and physical perfection. Another thing to think about is, they're trained in the military for specific jobs and for warfare. So, when they are in a combat zone, it's not adaptive to be fully aware of your emotions and to stop what you're doing and ask for emotional support. No, that's not effective. It's not going to help keep them alive. And so there's a bigger picture of military culture where promoting this idea of emotional and physical perfection. There's also, specific training within the military that doesn't necessarily facilitate emotional awareness or willingness to open up about these things. But then there's these other aspects where it's like fear of judgment. They're worried they're going to be judged. Maybe they're worried they're going to be perceived as somebody like that's shown up in media. Um, I would also say, like, if you're dealing with people who have PTSD, who've either seen or done things that they are scared of or regret or feel guilty about, there's a lot of fear about even just asking for help because admitting to some of those things that have happened. Regardless of how we might actually react to them in real life, there's a understandable fear that you might be judged for asking for help for those kind of things. There's a part of the learned fear of impact on career. There's an idea of, or not an idea, the reality is openly talking about your mental health struggles or psychological distress can lead to changes in your duties and assignments. And I've had veterans talk to me about how they've basically never they try not to talk to when they were serving, try not to talk to anybody about their depression because they weren't going to be allowed to fly anymore. And then they knew what would happen. And so there's a fear of what can happen in terms of your day-to-day tasks, but also in terms of your career and what you're wanting to do in the military moving forward. I talked about the guilt, shame, and feeling embarrassed as well. Even if the underlying culture is uh, that we're promoting emotional and physical perfection, there can also just be some shame or embarrassment about like, well, I'm not tough enough to get past this, or I should have been tougher. I shouldn't be dealing with this kind of sadness or this kind of anxiety. Just even feeling embarrassed that you feel anxious, period. That can be a real thing that can get in the way of veterans asking for help. And then the lack of trust part. I mean, we saw at the beginning of this call, right, that most people here are not veterans. Now, if we could pair every single veteran who needs help with a veteran therapist or a veteran physician, I mean, that would be great. It'd probably smooth the process a little bit for many of them. It might increase accessibility or willingness to talk or willingness to come in and seek help. But the reality is like that's just not our field. That is not the healthcare field. It's not comprised mostly of veterans. And so we have to find a way, for those of us who are civilians, we have to be aware that there is going to be a lack of trust, but also find a way to kind of bridge that gap and to acknowledge it and not dismiss it, but also do some kind of work to build up that trust. And I think another part of that means that we don't give up, right? We don't give up. We understand that that is an underlying factor for people seeking help. And so we try to gently and collaboratively push to continue building up that relationship and building up that trust over time, even if it doesn't happen right away. So, and the other thing on this slide is talking about stigma, that there is stigma about mental health within the military. There's also stigma even, when they separate and go into transition to civilian life, there's still stigma around that. Even general population, there's stigma around mental health. I think that's probably getting better, but if you're a veteran and you have transitioned to civilian life and you still have your veteran community, there's stigma within that, or there's stigma maybe within your family potentially. So all of those things are things that contribute to making it difficult to ask for help. Okay, number 11, they want us to know that the military service changes them, and there's not a whole lot to say here except just that being in the military changes people, and from their perspective, and I think one way to think about it is it's very understandable, I think, for those of us who have not actually served. I think we can all understand that if you go into service and you commit your life and however many years to that lifestyle and that kind of job and those kind of experiences, then yeah, you're going to come out a different person, right? You're gonna come out a little bit different, and they want us to know that that change is permanent and that's okay. I think specifically what we're talking about here is that again, you're not going to be the same person you were before you entered the military. And there are some things about that that will continue and that are okay. There are some things that are not always permanent. Like we would hope that if we just go to PTSD, for example, we would hope that someone wouldn't suffer from severe PTSD symptoms for the rest of their life, and that part is not permanent. But just the fact that you're not the same person you were before is okay. And there's some like acceptance to that. And understanding that let's not pretend like we are trying to be the same person we were before. Okay. Number 12, they want us to know that they differ in how much they identify with the military after they leave active duty. This one's really important, and I think I learned this over time just working with different folks that you have I think as a general public, we have an understanding of how our society views veterans, right? That we kind of lift them up as heroes and as respected and revered and all these kind of things. And I think there is maybe an assumption sometimes that everybody wants to adopt that identity after they have separated and after they are, just they're a civilian or just a veteran and no longer serving active duty, that everyone kind of wants to adopt that identity. And that's not true. Some people go into the military for very specific reasons. Maybe it's even just like pay for school later, go in the military. Okay, got the GI Bill, paying for school, good. Now I'm going to do this entirely different career and just kind of move on. That exists. Some people really adopt, or not adopt, but they really take on that veteran identity as a core part of who they are and how they function in daily life. And that's also okay too. So there's just a range in terms of how people identify with this aspect, how much they kind of integrate that into their daily life and who they are and who they see themselves being moving forward. And just being aware that that's going to be different and that's okay. Wherever they fall on that spectrum is okay. There's not a good or bad way of doing it. Okay, we're almost there to 15. Man, time is flying by. Okay, I'm sorry. I want to make sure we have time for questions too. Number 13, our families serve with us. Yeah, they want us to understand that the families are a big part of it, and families experience it really is unique and challenging because when you think about it, they are not serving directly, but they are going with the service member, right? So there's issues with not being with their loved one. There's issues with moving all the time. If you're moving all the time and you have a partner, or what do they do for a job? What do they do for work? How do they navigate that process? What is it like to try and find a new job every time you move to a different place? What about kids in school? Changing schools all the time. How do you get established? For both the kids and partners, how do you establish social support? How do you establish your core social network, wherever you are, if you're constantly having to move? Not to mention having to deal with sometimes not being with your loved one if they're deployed and feeling anxious and maybe scared about how they're doing. And so the family's experience of military life is very different from the rest of us. And so in that way, they serve with the service members too. And it's important for us as we're providing care to veterans to keep in mind how their family has been affected and how that indirectly affects the veteran too. But also, you may not work with a veteran directly, but maybe you work with somebody who is a family member of a veteran. I think I saw a bunch of people mention in the chat that their spouse or parent or things like that were family members, or service members. So y'all know what I'm talking about. It's an important thing to keep in mind that they want us to know and that we should consider moving forward. Okay, last two. These are pretty self-explanatory. They want us to know that they would die for each other and their country, and that they all made the sacrifice for a reason to serve something more important than themselves. And that, I think, hopefully we have some understanding of that. We probably will never be able to fully understand it unless we experience it ourselves, but they want us to understand or know that uh, that is a big driver for what they do, and that value system is there. And within the military culture, there is, those values of honor, commitment, and duty. And going back to the branch discussion, each branch also has their own set of kind of values that they emphasize and that they try to live out. And so go all of these things, again, speaking to another area or another example of how serving in the military, when they separate and transition to civilian life, they take away some of these values and ability to live out these values as strengths that they can apply to other areas of their life, hopefully. Okay. So that's 15 things to know about vets. Again, if you want more information, check it out. They have some great videos too. But that's kind of, I think the best way to kind of rapid fire, talking about veteran culture. The other thing that before we switch over to questions and just discussion, I want to just offer some other tips. When I talk to students or other folks who are potentially working with veterans, I always talk about the difference between cultural competency versus humility and sensitivity. So if you are not a service member, you're not a veteran yourself, we're never really going to know what it is like, right? If we try to strive for cultural competence, there's something in that word that kind of implies that there's like a finish line, and we have broken the tape and we've crossed the finish line. We're like, okay, now we don't need to. We know all there is to know about working with veterans and veteran culture, and I don't think that will ever be true if you didn't actually live that life. And so instead of going about your work and caring for this population with the mindset of like, let's strive for being competent, I would recommend striving for cultural humility and cultural sensitivity. And what that means specifically is just being humble that you might not know everything about veterans. That's probably pretty easy for most of us to do. But also just having the humility of, even if you learned a bunch of stuff about veteran culture, or learned even if you've worked with maybe a bunch of veterans for years and years and years, and you think you got it down pat, but what about if you have somebody walk in and they had a different experience, and that experience is one you've never seen before, and just having the humility to say like, hey, I might not know everything about this person, this veteran who's sitting across from me right now, and what they've gone through. And then also the sensitivity part is just understanding that maybe there are things about their experiences that could impact our work together, even if it's as basic as like, how much are they willing to trust me or allow me to open up to me, and thinking like, well, what about their specific culture and the way they've described it, their veteran culture, the way they've described it and lived it, is potentially going to impact the way that we work together. And so important to think about, yeah, targeting, again, that's my recommendation, is aiming for humility and sensitivity, cultural humility and sensitivity, rather than competence. And I think if you take that approach, regardless of how much you've learned today or how much you've learned in other instances, it's gonna take you a lot further. The other, I mean, really obvious, but my other tip is just to listen. I think I've encountered plenty of veterans who, especially who have tried to get help but feel like they're just talked at or talked to. And if you just listen to folks, if you just listen to veterans, it's like anyone, that will take you a long ways. You'll learn a lot, but then you'll also you're going to gain a lot of respect and credibility by doing that. Um, Beware the number three, beware of potential issues with mental health or integration and avoid making assumptions. So going back to this like balance of the discussion I was having with PTSD, you know, be we don't want to assume that everyone has PTSD, but it would be a disservice if we didn't walk into, working with a veteran, especially if it's in a mental health context, and just think, hey, there is the potential that this person may have been exposed to traumatic events, and how might that be affecting them, even if they were resilient through that or something. It's important to be aware of that, but not again jump to conclusions or make assumptions about what's going on. There are, even with PTSD specifically, there are so many different ways that you can reach a PTSD diagnosis. I play this game with my class when I'm teaching it. I won't do it now, but we basically take a guess of like how many different ways can you form a mental health or a PTSD diagnosis using all the different combinations of the symptom clusters and everything. It's over 600,000 ways. There are just so many different ways that a given person can present with PTSD. So you don't want to make assumptions that everyone is going to look the same. The other part that just quickly about the integration aspect is that it's not just potential mental health issues because of their experience, but the transition from serving in the military and being active duty to going to civilian life, that is a that transition period is a big time of stress for a lot of veterans. It's a huge change. It's a huge shift. Some veterans are losing like a core sense of their identity, a core sense of who they are. Some veterans are losing their community that has really was constantly around them and providing all that support and kind of bolstering them up and helping in a lot of different ways that maybe not fully known or aware of at the moment. So just again, not making assumptions, but just understanding that the transition period from serving active duty to civilian life it's a big transition, and it can bring out a lot of stressors and can be really difficult for folks. And I've talked about PTSD a lot, but we also know that issues with suicide and suicide attempts and suicidal ideation, there's a big problem with that within the veteran community. And lots of people are doing really awesome work and trying to even focus on that transition period of like, what can we do to provide the right support as they make this change, this big lifestyle change, so that folks aren't suffering from thoughts of suicide or thoughts of death, or we reduce the risk of things like that happening during that time. So again, not making assumptions, but just don't be blinded to the possibility that those kind of things can happen, and the possibility that veterans might not be super open about it either, right? They might not just want to come out and say, I'm struggling. So that's why we have to be aware. The last part is follow through. And I honestly think this is one of the big things that I have done that has led me to be successful with the positive relationships that I have formed with veterans in different like veteran communities is when you tell them you're going to do something, do it. If you don't deliver, you're in trouble. You're going to be in trouble. No, I mean, just from the sense like you're losing credibility, right? And unfortunately, a lot of veterans who might be in need of healthcare, they maybe have sought it out before and it just hasn't worked out, or people haven't followed through, or it's taken too long. And so there is going to be a built-up expectation of like, I don't know, again, I don't know if I can trust, not just trust to open up, but like trust that this person's going to do what I ask them to do. So if you don't follow through with what you say, that's going to be a big notch against you, and it's going to be hard to build that trust over time. If you deliver and are consistent and only say what you're actually going to do, that will take you a really long way, in building up that trust and that rapport and that relationship, which is important. Okay, last slide, and then I want to have some time for questions. I'm sorry, I think I'm going longer than I intended, but I want to talk about crisis and mental health resources. So the Compact Act was somewhat recent legislation that basically provides the opportunity now for, in the case of a crisis emergency, for veterans to get free access to emergency mental health care. And so it doesn't matter if the veteran is, they're enrolled in the VA or things like that. If you're working with a veteran and there's a crisis situation or they need emergency care, veterans can get that. All veterans can get that, and they can get it for free. And that can extend, depending on the type of care they need. They can get free services up to 90 days outpatient and 30 days inpatient, I believe is what it is. But that's important to know. And the way to actually access these resources for either yourself or with, conveying this information to veterans specifically is there's the crisis line, which veterans used to have like their own crisis line, but now you can dial the 988 number, which is the nationwide suicide crisis line, and veterans can select one, and then that will automatically take them to the veteran specific crisis line. There's options within there to text or chat too, if they would prefer that. Other things that they can do, veterans can call 911, they can go to an emergency room, they can go to any VA medical center. Again, with this with the Compact Act, it doesn't matter. They don't have to go to a specific place. It's just any place, regardless of any of the other contacts. As a veteran, they're eligible for free emergency mental health care. And then to search specifically for if someone is looking for a VA medical center or VA center, if they go to va.gov, find locations, you can choose whether or not you want to look for a VA health center or a vet center and enter, wherever your location is, and then that can identify the specific area or the closest center to you. Okay, that was a lot. And again, I apologize. I think I went way longer than I wanted to, but I want to stop. I'm going to exit out of here and see if there are any questions that I can answer before we wrap up. And thank you all for your attention. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. That was very great. If you do have any questions, please come off of mute or type it in the chat. We would be happy to take your questions. And Jim just posted in the chat connector toolkit website for Michigan Center for Rural Health.
Trying to scroll through. It looks like someone caught a typo. It is not the Marine Crops Reserve. Thank you for correcting me on that. See, hey, I'm open to all corrections. Thank you, sir or ma'am, whoever did that. I appreciate it. Marine Corps Reserve. Apologies for that one.
We have one. Are all mental services free to veterans via VA hospital centers?
Can you repeat that question again? Are all
mental health services free to veterans via the VA hospital or centers?
That's a good question. I think the important thing to know is there's free emergency mental health services. So that's a part of that Compact Act. Now, to get access to VA services specifically, veterans have to basically apply to be enrolled in a given healthcare system to do that. And it is most veterans are eligible. There are some instances when they are not. And then there are also some folks who don't want to go to the VA too, which is okay. But yeah, to clarify, it's specifically it is the emergency mental health services that is free.
We just had someone say she was surprised to learn that the PTSD rates were what you said. She said that media makes it sound much higher than that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I think that's tough. It sounds low. I understand what you're saying. It sounds lower than kind of what it feels like. But for any of you who are specifically doing like mental health care work, I mean, and if anyone who's worked with veterans, even with that lower number, the amount of people who still have untreated PTSD is it's crazy. It's so high. And I think the other issue the other argument that people would make in terms of why maybe that number is not 100% accurate is because it's very possible that that number is higher and there are plenty of people who are just not reporting it, right? For the specific reasons we talked about with, military culture and maybe reluctancy to seek out help. So it is possible that that number is higher, but I can tell you that it's still way too high. I think just even recently I was pulling some numbers from Texas, and I think I found, as many as like 75,000 veterans in the state of Texas who had a PTSD diagnosis for longer than a year and are not seeking treatment. Which that feels like a lot to me. That's a lot. That's a lot of people. That's a more than our task force can handle, in terms of the mental health care field. So, yeah, it's still a big number that needs a lot of work for sure.
I think we have maybe one time for one more question. And
Sure.
someone said that any advice to get veterans to trust the VA again? She said she had a lot of trouble getting veterans to reapply for benefits since the PACT Act was put in place.
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, I think, um, I mean, I would have a discussion about there's some uncertainty when you're dealing with any kind of federal agency, right? And so there's definitely folks who will feel discouraged by those kind of processes. Um, I think I would just have a discussion with that veteran about, well, what is it is it worth it to you? Is it worth it to you to keep trying despite the unknown outcome? Or is it worth it to you to give up? What are you potentially giving up if you don't continue to try? Almost like a pros and cons type of thing, but more of like, how does continuing to try despite the uncertainty, how does that fit with how you want to live out the rest of your life? Because for some folks, it's very like that kind of support and financial stability is essential, and they can't work, and it's really, really tough. And it's also very easy to get discouraged on those sort of things. So I would have kind of a more bigger picture because I don't think you can convince them. That's the point I guess I'm trying to get at is I don't think you're ever going to say like, you can't just tell them to do it. And they're like, okay. I mean, if we could just tell everybody what to do, like all of our jobs would probably be a lot easier, right? But it won't work like that. So I would take that approach if that was at all helpful.
Thank you. And Adrian just dropped the link in the chat, and then you can always scan the QR code here. Thank you so much for being here today. I know there's a couple other questions, so I don't know if you have a moment to stay on or if
I
everybody.
do, yeah. I'm happy to stay on for a couple minutes if people have specific questions. Yeah, I'm more than happy to do that for sure. But thank you again, everybody, for coming and for your attention. And I assume you being here means you're willing to work with veterans or interested in with working with veterans. So thank you for your efforts in that area and good luck to you moving forward. Thank you.
Before you guys leave, I was having internet trouble. I just wanted to make sure I was in attendance. This
Yes,
is Keith Graham. Keith Graham.
I will make notes and it should track you via Zoom. So thank you. And then just
You're
be
welcome.
sure to make sure you get that evaluation and I'll just check your
Okay,
attendance.
and that's in the chat.
Yep, chat and we could type it again or you
Okay.
can scan here.
Okay. I may be asking too much, but can you send me the link to my email just in case it goes out on me again?
Yes, and I will send a follow-up email with the evaluation one more time as well. So,
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much.
yep. And
Okay.
thank you. Thank you all for attending and thank you so much, Adam. This was very enlightening and it was really great to have you.
For sure. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Adam.